M-Pesa's runaway success in Kenya did wake up the other markets that you needed to embrace new technology as a way, again, of enabling financial inclusion.
Hi, thanks for joining us. It's Ronit and Gaurav on the latest episode 3 of season 3. Did I get that right, Gaurav?
I think you did. You almost had me at episode 3, like we were doing a brand new podcast. I guess we are in a way, but it's episode 74, 75.
I lost track. So I thought episode 3 of season 3 would be easier because I don't know. We're at episode 70 something. It's been a while since we started, and we're delighted to have an extra special guest with us today, zooming in from Edinburgh, where she's recording, Margaret O'Connor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Margaret, where are you normally based? Edinburgh is not your home base, right?
No, that's correct. Ronit, I am based in London. I moved there just before COVID, having spent the 2 previous decades on the ground in Africa, originally from New York City, and spent my early life in Asia. So real emerging markets person, but London, as you well know, is a great global city and opportunity to stay ahead of what's happening in fintech.
Totally. I hadn't realized you'd spent the previous 2 decades. I know you spent a lot of time in Africa, but that's a fair amount of time, and you must have seen so much change. Whereabouts in Africa did you spend those couple of decades?
So my husband and I moved to Johannesburg. I joined him in 2003 from New York City. He was sent there to set up Barclays Africa merchant banking operations. And I sold a tech business where I'd been an operator in New York City, and we built out the company across the US, Europe, and Asia. So having exited that business, I built a beach house in Cape Town, and was committed to taking a family break, having children, writing a book, having a good life. But I must say the lure of traveling into Africa with John was really great. So I, had the opportunity to travel in Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria to see, and got to meet, since he was at Barclays, the who's who in African corporate, the leading, listed companies, as well as some of the regulatory folks across Africa from 2003. So at that time, South Africa was completely cut off, from the countries north of Limpopo, and we were in the first wave of professionals from South Africa really looking to collaborate and do business across the continent. So it's very, very exciting times.
So Margaret, that was a really interesting introduction to how you sort of got to know Africa. Let's zoom forward to the more recent years. You're chairperson of Launch Africa, the VC fund out of South Africa, which is Pan Africa. I believe it's the largest, or one of the largest, early stage investors. To the audience who, unlike Gaurav and myself, don't know what Launch Africa is about, give them a little flavor. What is Launch Africa? Who are the people behind it? Why are you involved in it?
So Launch Africa is the first institutional venture capital investor in most tech companies across Africa. We were established in 2020 with the mission to fill the gap of investment capital for companies that had already proved the product market fit, usually working with an enterprise customer such as a bank, insurance company, or a mobile network operator, to establish their technology in their home market. And Launch Africa's job was to bank those companies that are already earning at least $20,000 US dollars in monthly recurring revenue. In markets like Nigeria, the median value or MRR of the companies we invest in is usually closer to 50. But we're definitely not investing in idea stage companies. It's companies with a leadership team that have the capability to become one of Africa's leading companies in their category. So lots of ambition, lots of drive, lots of talent. And Launch Africa, in addition to the investment capital. So, and we had a 36.3 million fund one. Our biggest check size was 300,000 in a seed round. We were able to lead many of the seed rounds because we had a free co-investment, no fees, no carries, with some of our 255 LPs. So this idea of bringing smart money into Africa, we, the VC fund, would do all the due diligence, but our global investors, who are generally private equity partners, venture capital partners, corporate execs, family offices, or corporate execs, high net worth individuals investing in their personal capacity. So Launch Africa is very much an ecosystem investor. We initially sourced our deals from the incubators and accelerators across Africa. These days, now that we're all of 3 years old, Launch Africa is increasingly looking to our founders in our portfolio of 133 companies for recommendations on the best companies to invest in, because our founders are seeing who's filling the value chain gaps in fintech, health tech, ed tech, agri-tech, logistics and mobility, and the future of work. So we're a multi-sector investor across all of Africa, South Africa, North Africa, Francophone Africa, East Africa, even the Indian Ocean Islands.
I think we've seen the pictures of Zach from Sudan and DRC. Or maybe those are just on Instagram. I don't know.
And you know, I do want to dispel the myth. Although Zach, as we all know, is incredibly larger than life, you know, and he's absolutely, you know, the rock star front man. But you know, I think why Launch Africa has worked so well is that, you know, each member of the leadership team can complement the skills and experiences, both business and life experience, of the other members of the team. And we've made so much room for the young, you know, analysts and venture partners who've joined the staff to grow and develop beyond their wildest imaginations in the last 3 years. So it's been an incredible journey to see really ambitious and talented young Africans join Launch Africa and really fly. You know, I think the real magic of Launch Africa has been the portfolio connectivity. So we've created a genuine place where founders can share, you know, their pain and their opportunities with their peer group. And because we have this WhatsApp channel for the 180 co-founders in Launch Africa and our Gender Lens Investment Fund 535, these co-founders, as I said, are, you know, swapping tips about service providers, teaming up to approach enterprise customers, and generally supporting each other when they're looking at international expansion. So it's been absolutely brilliant to see, you know, how they have helped each other grow and develop, as well as our management team. Two other pieces of Launch Africa that I think it's really important to understand: how we've been able to invest in so many companies across so many geographies. We're really blessed to have a very strong advisory board. So yes, it's a team. Zach can fly as he does because there are a lot of people, you know, doing the prep work and the follow-up work.
No, I had a really interesting conversation with Junaid about a week ago when we were discussing mindsets and how for him, and I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. So Junaid, kill me later if you want to. But,
here we go.
We're talking about what kind of characterizes, and it's a massive generalization coming up. So apologies to the billion-plus residents and citizens of 54 countries in Africa and territories, and so it's a massive generalization coming up. But we were discussing the abundance mindset versus the scarcity mindset. This is one of Zach's Junaid's theses, theories. an academic one, but also a practical one, and he was really illustrating his response to my question, which was like, sum up why Africa or founders in Africa are different to say founders in the US or in Europe. And he brought up this mindset difference, which is in the US, you get a second chance. And maybe it's 3 strikes and you're out. Whereas oftentimes in many parts of Africa, and of course there is privilege and there are elites and so on, some of whom are fabulously wealthy, but it's normally 1 strike and you're out. And so he was saying, look, I grew up with this scarcity mindset. I'm always half glass empty. And Zach, I guess, who grew up in the Middle East and bit in the US, is half glass full. And I was saying that resonates so much with me because I was using the analogy of, and we were having this conversation. I was in India last week when we were having this conversation, and I was explaining, and we might lose you at this point in the conversation, Margaret. But
no, I'm totally with you. I'm totally with you.
But we were talking about cricket, and I was saying, I was at a conference last week, and following me on stage was this very famous Indian cricket commentator and just basically celebrity called Harsha Bhogle. And he, in one of his podcast interviews, he beautifully summed up how India had changed from when he was a child in the 60s and I was a child in the 70s. And it began to change, though Gaurav grew up in the Middle East in the 80s and 90s and now. And he said, look at, the analogy he was using was, in the days of Sunil Gavaskar, a very famous Indian cricket player I grew up watching, your main task as a cricket player was not to lose your wicket. You would defend your wicket. Whereas what's happened, particularly with maybe around, there were other players, but really with Virat Kohli and others, particularly the next generation that have come after Virat Kohli, your one player was recently quoted as saying, I don't even know where my wicket is. I'm going to hit the ball. I don't care where my wicket is. I'm hitting the ball and it's leaving the park. And if it somehow I miss, I'll get another shot tomorrow.
Okay.
That's a real American mentality.
Absolutely. But Ronit, I actually misconstrued when you started talking about Junaid and abundance mindset. Yeah. Because I would say, and I grew up relatively middle class in New York. So, surrounded by abundance, not necessarily.
Abundance, yeah.
Yeah. And very much a natural optimist. But in my long experience of Africa, and, and I grew up in business in Asia in the 90s. Yeah. So I saw what happened through, pre the boom, the financial crisis, all of it, right? Yeah. Huge transformation in Asia. And so when I got to Africa, I was very much seized, as you were saying, by the financial scarcity, but also the abundance of spirit, right? The incredible generosity of spirit of people, often rich and poor, but especially poor. And, I think that's one of Africa's greatest assets is people's generosity and, general desire to uplift themselves and the community together. And I think, Launch Africa very much believes in the rising tide lifts all. And so, the business operates incredibly from an abundance mindset in that, we're very open and transparent about how we do business, with whom we're partnering, and bringing many more people from the ecosystem into this community to uplift, them. So we, as a fund,
grow the pie mentality.
Absolutely grow the pie. But I couldn't agree more in terms of the limited opportunities for entrepreneurs and for fund managers. We do not have the luxury of a second chance. And, so I think that speaks a lot to the entrepreneurs who choose to seek venture funding, right? Like the typical Launch Africa co-founder comes at a corporate, will have 7, even 10 years of business experience. They've built a little bit of a nest egg, and the black tax, right? most Africans need to pay for families' education, medical bills, right? So they've contributed to their family after benefiting from some formal education. And then they try to solve a problem that they can see, they experienced in an incumbent. And so that, they know they have one shot to solve this problem. So they never waste money. And, I think that's why I feel so at home at Launch Africa, because as an operator, even though I said I was, a tech founder in New York City, my business partners are South Asian from my, tech startup. We completely grew the business organically before we sought venture capital. We got funded from the first ever gender lens investment vehicle in New York City. The women who supported the news market, again, we're really feeding our organic growth, introducing us to Fortune 100 decision makers who could buy our services. So, although we started the news market during the internet 1.0 boom, we never, ever, we're trying to capture the entire market. It was like, who's going to pay for what services and lock and load on that and scale that way. So, Launch Africa, I think, will deliver financial results to our LPs because we bring that scarcity, make your dollar holler, stretch your budget mentality in supporting all of our portfolio companies and certainly in how we chose to structure and manage the fund to date.
Now, I first came across Launch Africa via Gaurav. I remember Gaurav introduced me to Zach and Junaid. And Gaurav, how did you get connected to Launch Africa? What kind of, or more importantly, what caught your interest in the fund, in investing in early stage in Africa? Why Africa? Why fintech? And what would you like to ask Margaret?
Well, thanks, Ronit and Margaret. A pleasure to hear the story. It's a lot to take in, so thanks for coming on and sharing it with us. And Ronit, I think the first thing I have to do is share a story about Zach, because if I don't, it's just not fun. So I have to say,
is this suitable for work or?
It is.
It is. It's okay.
It is. The non-suitable stuff people can ask us off the record. So contact us. Our podcast will give you all the dirt on Zach. No, but seriously. So I was in Washington and I met a very prominent early investor that had done many, many, many IPOs, and he says, "You're based out of the Middle East, but do you have any exposure to the continent of Africa when it comes to investing?" And I said, "I wouldn't know where to start, but I do have a desire to learn. And if it's interesting, I'd like to, yes, deploy my own capital. And as you know, Ronit, I only deploy my own capital." So I got introduced to this guy called Zachariah. And I was like, okay, here we go. What's he going to sell me? And I saw a picture of Zach and I'm like, oh my God, it's VC Jesus from Africa.
Absolutely, the Messiah.
It is VC Jesus. That is Zach. Zach is VC Jesus. I'll print t-shirts to it, right? So I'm like, I cannot take this person. I can't do this. But when I spoke to Zach and we had a conversation, it's like I had found my long lost, mad, happy, energetic, extremely articulate, interesting, and better brother who actually knew what he was talking about and very impassioned and had a lot of good data behind him. And so honest and had so much integrity that I think after the first few conversations we had, he was so transparent. He opened up his personal portfolio to me and said, "This is what Africa looks like from an opportunity basis." And I said, "Wow, let's go." And he introduced me to some opportunities in the beginning before I even put money into the fund, which will be unicorns and have been unicorns. And I didn't have to wait for them to become unicorns to know it was going to happen because his integrity spoke for itself. So that was the first interesting thing. The other thing about Zach, which is now embarrassing, is he's the only VC guy that carries a guitar with him everywhere he travels. So don't fall for it and don't entertain Zach. If he wants to play his guitar, run away. But I'm just kidding.
No,
yeah,
guitar and piano, right? He taught himself piano over COVID. So for your UK listeners, we're going to have an African market education night and party on October 12th. I said, we got to have a piano there. Piano man got to, lighten things up. And, part of my early days in South Africa was working with the wine industry in South Africa and helping the vineyard owners export their wine to China, the UK, and the US. So I know something about South African wine. So we believe you have to have fun as well as make money and make an impact. So
there you go. So Zach is a people person, and I think that works well when you're talking to entrepreneurs and rallying spirits and sharing information and stories and building a trusted circle and network, right? Whether it's with investors or entrepreneurs, and I think that's key for the continent, especially
and staff. And partners. So I was going to say very unique individual that has EQ, IQ, and as totally draws in all the tech bros. As the custodian of gender diversity, he's actually very empathetic, and he to women, and gives women a lot of opportunity, both founders, employees, partners. So the fact that his daughter Indy May has been in many, many business meetings since I think the age of 3. I think that keeps him honest,
Yeah. And so it's been a wonderful journey investing with Zach. I've introduced things to him, he's introduced things for me, and we have great conversations. And Margaret, for everyone that's listening on this call, I think when we think of investing in the continent and we think about the big names that flash up on social media when it comes to the continent, like your Jack Dorsey's and other such people, you spent a lot more time there and invested a lot more capital per se on a larger scale. Where do you see the next steps happening to ensure the sustainability of continued investment in the ecosystem? Because there's been a foundational change. There's been a brain drain reversal. There's been a lot of talent coming back to the continent. There's a lot of hunger for people to adopt technology because the infrastructure rails for communication and access to technology trickling down to almost everybody accessing mobile phones. It's become a nice standard template. Money has come in. But for the next phase that's coming through, there's a lot more elements like regulation, and there's other elements outside of regulation that need to solidify the next tranche of perhaps not seed investment, perhaps growth capital to come in. What's your take? Could you share with us what you're seeing across the continent in terms of regulation or confidence to the next levels of mature or larger investors to come in and continue the funding?
Sure. Well, I do want to make the point that there needs to be continued influx of early stage investment capital, right? Launch Africa opened it up, but there needs, we could easily, the ecosystem could easily absorb 10 times what we were able to raise in the first fund, and this is not all for Launch Africa. There are now regional seed stage VCs that are, very professional. I think we're really the only one that has the continent covered. So, number one point, we're really working hard to continue to bring more smart money into the African ecosystem. We're launching $75 million Fund 2 right now, capital raising for that. That's going really well. You're absolutely right about having a predictable regulatory infrastructure. So in my many years on the ground across Africa, when I moved to South Africa, I expected the payment companies, MasterCard and Visa, to be much more involved in regulatory engagement in the big economies, because that's what we did. When I was at MasterCard in Asia Pacific, we would sit down with the Bank of China, with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Indonesia, same thing, and really educate them about emerging technology and listen to, what was on the government ministers' minds, not just from financial regulation, but how digital payments could be a tool for economic development and other government priorities. So, I've always had that mindset and skill set, and I'm really pleased to see just now, like right now, that this more collaborative approach to regulatory engagement is happening, both with lawyers representing late stage funds as well as advisors to Launch Africa, the payment companies, and some of the bigger fintechs, working together to have a common voice and to listen and to promote, technology understanding within central banks and other regulatory authorities. So, we're definitely working in a pathway to enabling regulation. I think one of the big uncertainties globally is the introduction of AI acts, right? I was a guest of Endeavor when Reid Hoffman came to London, I think it was 2 weeks ago, and he was sharing with us how he had been in Europe and then UK, sharing private sector insights on how do you safeguard generative AI and ensure that there are some protocols in place to enable business to take off at this early stage when there's so many unknowns. Ronit, I think you're probably, more of an expert on blockchain and DeFi, but, for me, it's been really encouraging to see the sandboxes with the regulators in South Africa and Nigeria, a little bit in Ghana. And, I think an interesting dynamic was M-Pesa's runaway success in Kenya did wake up the other markets that you needed to embrace new technology as a way, again, of enabling financial inclusion, and also making it possible to collect taxes from small businesses in a cost-effective way. So I think that's been a huge driver of regulatory engagement in Ghana, was they're like, okay, let us really improve the tax collection base here, but we could keep taxes relatively low using digital technologies. And that's been a real winner. So that's government regulation. Important thing that Launch Africa, together with the African Venture Capital Association and Digital Collective Africa, we're working with these stakeholders to say, let us have a voluntary code of ethics and open source governance toolkits to ensure that as companies move from pre-seed to seed to Series A, it's very clear across all, geographic markets and tech verticals. This is what good governance looks like at pre-seed. This is how your financial reporting, your privacy protocols, your fraud prevention, your advisory board needs to move into a fiduciary board at Series A, and just really so that founders can budget and recruit appropriately, not load up too early at pre-seed, but to recruit and plan so that they are ahead of the curve when it comes to outreach for, later stage investors, and also making it much quicker and easier for those companies that are looking at mergers, acquisitions, and trade sales to ensure that they have, the toolkit that they need to become an attractive candidate for whatever their financial objectives are.
I think it's super important, right, to give that stability and reassurance for regulation, whether it's for investment or whether it's for the financial sector or other sectors where startups are concentrated on being established as a disruptive channel for entrepreneurs to build businesses in the continent. I think that's a key element that's coming out and happening to standardization. But it seems to be a case of, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, it seems to be a case of people are building technology and use cases quicker than regulation can catch up, which is true to a certain degree. I don't know what the gap is, but looking forward, do you see in the coming cycle of the next 3 to 5 years, do you see governments that are now stepping up to the plate, adopting fresher sandboxes, lighter, flexible ecosystems for people to, do you see them taking an active role in actually making fiscalization policy, taxation policies, perhaps inheritance policies, different policies which may actually inadvertently cause the ecosystem to grow? Because we've seen this in
no,
Turkey,
intentional policies, absolutely mindfully trying to help grow the technology ecosystem. So, small business is the backbone of the African economy. So, right, governments across the continent understand, to the extent that we can enable young people, digital natives, to upskill themselves to participate in the digital economy, both locally and globally, right? Stronger tax base, more stable communities, more stable countries. So we've been absolutely encouraged by the Startup Act movement across the continent. Tunisia, Senegal, those two stand out as like the most enlightened and progressive countries for startup acts.
Really?
So, yeah, Tunisia, unbelievably progressive. So, Sovereign Wealth Fund, looking to invest both in Tunisia and into other African markets. They pay for startups they subsidize the salary of startups during the first year of operations.
Wow.
So really, decreasing the pain.
I've been hearing about Kigali, I've been hearing about other places, but not Tunisia. Is great.
Yeah, Tunisia's amazing. Senegal also extremely progressive. Nigeria was the first country in Africa to enact the Startup Act. There is some capital available to startups. You're absolutely right about Kigali. So I wanted to mention that the Rwanda Department of Health has been working together with Novartis and the Global Fund and Norscan to create a pathway for health tech startups to actually deliver services within the Department of Health, clinics and preventative healthcare and diagnosis. So it's it's amazing. And this little, Rwanda clearly will inspire other ministers of health. I think in my many years working across Africa, the ministers of health in many countries were often, people who came from the private sector and had a incredible knowledge base and an incredible commitment to making life measurably better in their country. So I'm very, encouraged by the example in Rwanda, and we'll work, with other ecosystem players to ensure that these government health systems over time become open to relevant health tech suppliers. The other piece I wanted to talk about, because I think your podcast audience and you too in particular, when Zach, Junaid, and I were in Europe this past June, many of our existing LPs, encouraged us to think about, in addition to our equity investments in the next generation of startups, how do we build bridges to global development? Whether it's UN agencies, the Global Fund, as I said, we're working in Rwanda. We're really looking at who are the champions in multilateral organizations and global development initiatives where we have mission alignment. They are sitting on $49 billion coming into Africa. So, for example, I was at a conference in London that was organized by Oxford University Refugee Services, the Oxford University Foundation, and IKEA Foundation, and another philanthropist. And I wanted to jump out of my seat because, we have in Launch Africa, Mohammed Karar, a refugee from Sudan who, finished his education in the US, but who really opened my eyes to the reality of life of a refugee and how few of them ever get out of a camp, in Africa. So, I went up to the founders, the organizers of this event in Oxford. I said, respect, I know you guys do amazing academic work, and the foundations here clearly are trying to use technology to improve the lives of people in refugee camps and to provide them better access to health, education, and work. Instead of spending all of your time and money in Europe and the UK, can we not create some pilots where we connect you to companies in our portfolio and more broadly who have relevant services in health and education, where, you guys are funding it. So instead, Launch Africa's starting proposition in helping our companies grow their revenue is, of course, corporate. But, there are other categories of enterprise customers, whether multilateral organizations and government are two of these other. We totally understand that procurement from a multilateral organization or government is extremely painful and often extremely time consuming. So, we would only want to open that door to founders when the pathway has been cleared and there is, an accelerated time path. So anyway, this is how we're looking at ensuring the successful scale up of startups. It's not just using traditional sources of private capital, but other blended finance solutions.
Thanks so much for sharing that. I mean, it's from our perspective, the way that you're investing is not one-dimensional. Clearly, it's multi-dimensional, and it's really good to see that, you're trying to stitch together as many people into the conversation to understand the benefits, not only from a return perspective, but also to an ecosystem perspective, which is very important because that just hopefully compounds, right? And that's the effect we really want to generate and be a part of, because it leads to the success and growth of people's wealth categories, knowledge categories, and hopefully sustainable job creation, wealth creation that has good impact without being a direct social contributor. But one last question from my side before I hand back to Ronit. I was in San Francisco 8 years ago or 7 years ago, and a very, very dear friend of mine who is a prolific fintech investor in North America introduced me to a young woman whose company was just raised her Series B. And I hadn't come across her before. It was my starting out journey in investing in fintech. So her company is called Tala.
Okay.
And so it was way before I think the conversation had really become mainstream on understanding gender parity, showcasing conversations for even a platform of parity for women entrepreneurs to talk about what they were doing and how they were doing things, let alone, the leadership qualities and characteristics, which shouldn't have to be mentioned, but were mentioned and highlighted. So that was the first instance I was exposed to in terms of women in technology on the continent, because I didn't have that access or learning. Can you tell us more about, well, what is Tala doing today and how are they doing today? And also, can you tell us, what does that landscape look like today for women technology investors? Ronit and I have had the pleasure of having, very notable founders from the continent who are the founders of financial technology companies on our earlier podcasts as well. And we always look for more to share. So can you tell us more about, is Tala still leading the way forward? Are other people following? Is there more that we should know about? We'd love to hear more about this aspect.
Absolutely. What a great story. I really like that. So I haven't followed Tala closely in the last few years. I believe they're doing well. I mentioned early, my work with Grace and Michelle and this Pan-African Women in Finance Network. So the funders, both institutional and individuals, are there. And I learned from another fund manager. So there's probably a half a dozen of Africa-focused gender smart investors. And Launch Africa was not intentionally focused on gender lens investment, but because we're all about coming in at a low valuation and creating real value for our shareholders. We have 25% of our portfolio have female founders. So we have found some amazing women who are running technology and technology-enabled companies across the continent. I think one of the most exciting companies is BitMama. So a Lagos-based founder with a crypto card and very rapidly scaling remittance company. Junaid has been mentoring her quite closely. In Africa, there are quite a few different professional support groups for women in technology. So I'm a mentor to a couple of them. I'm also on the investment committee of 535 Ventures, Launch Africa's sister fund, which is an intentional gender lens investment vehicle. Hema Valba started 535 together with Junaid, and she did so after 15 years of running a nonprofit called WomEng. So Gaurav, in terms of like role models for women in technology, WomEng has been an absolutely important institution. It ensured that girls and women in Africa have access to STEM training, right? So that's the starting point, to have the skills. And then it moved into, role model development, both in corporate, government, civil society, and now tech startups. So there's a lot of programmatic support for women interested in accelerating their careers in technology. But let's face it, right? As you've seen probably this movie many times, many of the all-male many companies founded by men they say we can't find the women to hire on their tech teams or anywhere. And it's really just them not being intentional about looking for that talent. It's there. And, Launch Africa 535, WomEng, Endeavor, there are many initiatives across the ecosystem to ensure that women at least can get in front of investors and have access to finance. But the global figures are disgusting. And it's really, really, really hard for extremely competent female founders to raise capital even today. Ronit, I think we've probably in the past spoken about NABU, so a digital clearing bank for Africa that's based in London. Gabrielle Patrick has been in this game for over 2 years and have had so many doors slammed in her face because, who's this Black woman looking for venture capital money for a UK licensed bank? So, I listened with great interest to your podcast with Anne Bowden, who, I think in the UK has been an incredible force for breaking down barriers and proving to investors and the people who said no that she could build a profitable digital bank that was an employer to many women and underrepresented talent. So, I think Anne's example has inspired many female CEOs. And we at Launch Africa and 535 need to do a better job, in all honesty, of showcasing some of these success stories of women who've broken through. But I'm encouraged by, again, the peer support networks that exist and, social media and the return to travel has mean that there's been quite a few forums for people to find each other and help each other. So there is some good news. And, after the podcast, happy to send you a list of some of the, female founders that we're most excited about.
I was just about to say, send them over, Margaret. Would love to try and put as many as we can into our schedule that, we can give a platform and a voice to. And from my side,
one of the
thank you
things
so much. Yeah. Ronit,
one thing we
back to
can
you.
do is just Margaret's just been talking about Ruth, the founder and CEO of Bitmama, and I was Googling it while Margaret was talking. It's episode 37.
Oh, she was on.
2022. We had Ruth on October 2022. So
Okay, great.
I think we kind of hyperlink that episode with this episode. So we did have Ruth on, and I remember that was, exactly a year ago.
Okay,
There we go.
and just feeding your blockchain knowledge. So Guerra Kawani, so she's entrepreneur in residence, Web3 entrepreneur in residence at MFS Africa. Wow. Take no prisoners, Kenyan who commutes between the UK and East Africa, and had been a founder in remittance company in North America before doing her. She was one of the early employees of Monzo. But
Wow.
really
have to get her on then.
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
she's actually gonna run a crypto masterclass for Launch Africa on 535 in the next few weeks.
Awesome.
So again, abundance mindset. We help each other learn and grow.
Excellent. We probably need an episode 2 when we get Zach and Junaid back to.
I think so. Get the
and
band
we definitely
together.
have to have a couple of spin-off episodes with some of the founders, whether they're British, Kenyan, Nigerian, Tunisian, you name them. We want to make this a real focus for season 3. As we've had Ruth on already, so we've had
That's
some.
great.
And obviously, Anne is super famous. So we've had Anne on, and there's some really interesting stories to be told. I mean, Anne's story is a really interesting one, right? She'd grown up with some privilege, 30 years in finance, but she didn't fit.
No,
She
not at
didn't
all.
fit.
Not at all.
She had banking privilege, but she didn't fit the kind of the cookie cutter that the tech bro VCs were looking for, right?
No.
We'll probably hyperlink Anne's episode into this one as well, because there's some really good content there. But we are out of time. So thank you so much, Margaret, for joining us today.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you.
Thank you. Really great. Thank you.